Wow. Well, thank you. Wow, what a night this has been.
Kerry-Lynne Findlay has won the BC Conservative leadership race, defeating Caroline Elliott and the other candidates. And now the BC NDP is having a total meltdown on social media as they realize that David Eby's worst fear may have just come true. This raises an important question. Is the clock now ticking on the NDP's grip on power in British Columbia? I'm Elie Cantin-Nantel. Welcome back to the podcast. First, I do want to encourage you to subscribe if you have not already. It takes a second to hit that button. Up to 90% of my viewers are not subscribed, and subscribing helps amidst the alleged censorship of Bill C-11. Also, hit the notification bell to not miss videos, hype the video, like the video, and consider getting a channel membership for less than $5 a month, because I'm one of the only journalists left in this country that refuses to take subsidies from the federal government, meaning that our battle is one that is independently funded by the people. And now let's get to our podcast.
Journalism and commentary 1 year anniversary.
I don't believe journalism being funded by the government is the solution.
You have to rebuild the foundation. You have to retell the stories.
Market conservative
Other news that actually matters.
I hence wanted to ask. I think they should answer their questions, especially if they're politically charged with.
Ladies and gentlemen, your next leader and Premier of British Columbia, Kerry-Lynne Findlay.
Part 1, Kerry-Lynne Findlay's win. So last night, Kerry-Lynne Findlay won the BC Conservative leadership race that was triggered after the resignation of John Russ's dad. Findlay won the first ballot with 30.5% of the vote, followed by Caroline Elliott with 25.8%, Yuri Fulmer with 20.3%, Ian Black with 13%, and Peter Milobar with 10.5%. Now, it's important to note that the leadership race is decided on points and not votes. So every riding is given a number of points, and it's up to the candidates to win the most number of points in order to win the election. It's also how the federal Conservatives do their leadership race. They also use points and not popular votes. And the idea there is that, well, if you have one riding that has a lot more members, well, it's not just that riding that will decide the leadership race. It gives fair representation to the entire province, or in the case of the federal party, the entire country. Also, this is a ranked ballot, so people put their first, second, third, etc. choices, and the winner needs to have over 50% of the vote. So when you don't have over 50% of the vote, the last candidate gets eliminated, and the second, third, fourth votes are retabulated, recalculated until you get to a candidate that has over 50%. And last night, it took to the fourth ballot to get to that result. Kerry-Lynne Findlay won the fourth ballot with 51%, while Caroline Elliott had 49%. 25,000 members cast their ballots in this race, which accounted for 95% of those who were eligible to vote. After Findlay was declared the winner, she gave a short speech, and there's a couple of things in that speech that are worth highlighting. First, she clearly and well identified the main problems of British Columbia after almost a decade of socialist NDP rule.
NDP radical ideology has devastated property rights, backroom side agreements, and the NDP's economic vandalism has to end. Violent crime, drugs, chaos, and disorder in our neighborhoods. Right down the street here when we came in tonight. It's all within our grasp.
She also called out the globalist elite, which I applaud her for, because it's brave to do so. The legacy media hates when you call out the globalist elite, and they'll attack you as a conspiracy theorist and call you all these names when you do, but clearly KLF isn't scared of the legacy media, so she called them out.
We can be a powerhouse in our nation, a powerhouse no longer denied by Eastern and global elites, predatory foreign nations, and our own Constitution.
She also talked about the need for open and transparent government.
A Findlay government will negotiate in the open, will bring clarity and certainty, because that is what unleashing our natural resources, attracting investment, keeping our professionals practicing without censorship and promoting freedom demands, and will deliver.
And she talked about faith, family, and freedom, which I love to hear as a Christian. I think we need more of this in our politics. We need more Christians in our politics. So here's KLF talking about faith, family, and freedom.
Faith, family, and freedom. That's what it's all about. And truly. And I can't wait to get started. God bless British Columbia, and God bless all of you.
So personally, I am very happy with this result. As some of you may know, I had endorsed Kerry-Lynne Findlay, and that's because I think she is the woman of the moment for the situation in British Columbia. During the leadership campaign, she presented herself as the true blue Pierre Poilievre conservative, and she had a arguably very conservative platform. That platform included repealing DRIPA, which is the piece of legislation that's caused a lot of controversy in BC regarding reconciliation, land back, etc., and defending property rights, including by pursuing constitutional protections for property rights, rehiring provincial employees and healthcare workers that were fired for refusing the COVID-19 vaccine, supporting pipelines in British Columbia. How refreshing is that? Creating a Western alliance with Alberta and Saskatchewan, two provinces governed by conservatives, pushing back against federal gun bans, removing SOGI, gender ideology materials from schools, and introducing legislation to ban SOGI ideology in the classroom. She also said she would immediately ban the administration of social and medical gender transitions for children. She said she would ban biological males from girls' locker rooms. She told me she supports reopening mental health institutions, and she said she would use the notwithstanding clause if needed. But beyond her policies, Kerry-Lynne is just a very lovely person. I spent over an hour with her when I was in Vancouver because I interviewed her, and I just left with really good vibes about this woman. She has this demeanor of a very wise, intelligent, but also thoughtful, compassionate person. She's very genuine. You can tell she's thought everything through and that she's coming at it really from the right place. She's had a very successful career as a lawyer, as a federal politician. So hopefully she will be the next premier of British Columbia. Part 2, the NDP's meltdown. All of this brings us to the reaction from the BC NDP, which to me shows that they're worried about Kerry-Lynne Findlay and her ability to win the province. Let's start with David Ebie's reaction, which, to my surprise, was actually very classy, so kudos to him. And it was very different from other parts of his party that reacted very hysterically, and we will get to that too, don't worry. So David Eby said, quote, "Congratulations, Kerry-Lynne Findlay, on being elected leader of the BC Conservative Party. British Columbians are served by thoughtful debate, principled leadership, and a commitment to public service. I will work with anyone who is interested in putting people first." So yeah, I think that's a good statement. But meanwhile, here's how the BC NDP's official X account reacted to Kerry-Lynne Findlay winning. Even conservative MLAs don't support Kerry-Lynne Findlay and her Trump-style politics. She is the most extreme, divisive party leader in BC history. No wonder pro-Trump MLAs all back her. If you notice here, this statement doesn't address any policies that they disagree with her on. Instead, they're calling her MAGA, which is kind of this new slur in Canadian politics. If you don't like where someone stands or the views they have, instead of having a conversation or a debate, you just call them MAGA and say Trump, 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 as if that's supposed to do anything. It is genuinely confusing here because I don't understand what is MAGA about Kerry-Lynne Findlay. You know, Donald Trump is a very bombastic person. He says a lot of very provocative things, and that was kind of what made him rise to power, was people liked someone who was very bombastic and very out there. Whereas Kerry-Lynne Findlay is very, very thoughtful in everything she says. While she has principles and she will double down on her principles, she doesn't, provoke people on purpose. She handles it very differently. Her genuine conservatism definitely differs from the one of Donald Trump. But of course, maybe it's her policies that are MAGA. And you look at her policies, what she's proposing to do is restore safety in the streets, restore parental rights, restore property rights, make BC more affordable, build pipelines. I mean, these are just common sense conservative policies. And if you think that these policies are MAGA, then I think you're the one who has a problem and not Kerry-Lynne, to be very honest. Several NDP politicians repeated that talking point. Here is Ravi Kahlon, BC's NDP Minister for Jobs and Economic Growth. Maple MAGA won the BC Conservative leadership race. Bad news for British Columbians who want less Trump, not more. Again, Trump is president of the United States. What does that have to do with BC politics? Really? NDP MLA Darlene Ratchford? Kerry-Lynne Findlay is a real threat to the services people depend on. She campaigns like Trump and would govern like him too. And here I'm like, this is so unoriginal, girl. Like, really? That's all you can come up with? Basically, MAGA has become the new left-wing slur instead of racist. They used to call you racist when they didn't agree with your policies. Now they call you MAGA. Oh, wait. They also called Kerry-Lynne Findlay racist. Here's Jennifer Whiteside, BC's Minister of Labour, also NDP, of course. We live in a diverse and beautiful province. British Columbians don't want divisive, racist Trump-style politics. Jennifer, this is so original. And to that, I'll say two things. First, when is the last time that the racist smear worked? Hint, it doesn't. People see right through that. People don't buy that anymore. It's been tried and tested for 10 years and has failed every single time. And second, I would argue that there is no party that is more racist in British Columbia than the BC NDP. I mean, this is the party that supports DEI, which is racism. DEI is racist, and a lot of people of color oppose DEI because they view it as condescending. The whole idea that, well, you deserve special treatment because of your skin color is very offensive to a lot of people. And in BC, the BC NDP supports DEI ideology. So when the BC NDP calls someone like Kerry-Lynne Findlay a racist, to me, it also kind of is like projection because they're the ones who support DEI. Kerry-Lynne Findlay opposes DEI. But of course, the real reason for all of these cheap attacks is that all of these NDP politicians know that David Eby's worst fear came true last night. And I think his party knows that he's now in serious trouble. They're not celebrating today. I don't think they are. The NDP has governed British Columbia for almost 10 years, and many British Columbians have grown to be very frustrated with the state of the province. Housing prices are out of control. The average home in the Greater Vancouver area is $1.2 million. The opioid crisis is out of control. Over 18,000 people have tragically lost their lives to opioids since 2016. Extortion is out of control. The Indian-based Bishnoi gang, which is behind the extortion crisis, sent a letter to BC police boasting that it had 1,000 foot soldiers willing to carry out shootings. Property rights are under attack with things like a Cochan decision and people receiving letters. There's an investigation. I've been working on that's coming out soon, and I spoke to a lady who got one of these letters. And you have the growing wokeness crisis in schools with obsessive professors and teachers that do things like put all these activist flags in their schools and teach children ideology rather than the material that they should be learning, like science, math, etc. And these are just a few examples on the top of my head of BC's decline. A very sad situation, if you ask me. And I think this is part of why the polls now show that David Eby is one of the most unpopular premiers in Canada. The latest Angus Reid poll in BC has the BC Conservatives at 46% and the BC NDP at 36%, meaning the Conservatives now have a 10-point lead over the NDP. And according to 338 Canada, which is a polling site, the BC Conservatives have a 77% chance of winning the most seats, while the BC NDP has just a 22% chance of winning the most seats. So I think there's a good argument to make that David Eby and the BC NDP are cooked. And that is why the NDP is lashing out and calling Kerry-Lynne Findlay MAGA and racist. So remember that as you see their comments online. Do not fall for the bait and the negativity.
Caroline Elliott, you've taken a lot of heat for missing the first Juno News debate. If you had to decide over again, would you have attended the debate?
I made the right call. I suspect Yuri Fulmer, after tonight, probably is pretty happy I didn't attend that one.
Part 3, Caroline Elliott's loss. We also have to talk about what happened to Caroline Elliott. Look, I personally liked KLF. As I said, I endorsed her, but objectively, many people saw this race at the beginning as this being Caroline Elliott's race to lose. So let's talk about the mistakes of the Caroline Elliott campaign. I think they warrant some analysis. So starting at the very beginning, before she even announced she was going to run, I studied crisis communications. I was a staffer myself. I actually was also a campaign manager. When you lay down the groundwork, you have to do an analysis of the situation. You have to analyze what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what are the opportunities, and what are the threats. So in Caroline Elliott's case, what are the strengths and opportunities? Well, Caroline Elliott is a relatively young mother. She is energetic. She's passionate. She had some experience in BC politics. She had great connections. She was a policy wonk, so she put out a very conservative platform. In fact, her platform, if you go on her website, I don't know if her website will still be up by the time we post this, was very conservative. And in fact, had she won and became premier and implemented that, she would have been the most conservative premier in Canada. She had built a name for herself in the months prior as someone who's willing to engage with cultural issues. She had just co-founded a very successful new independent media venture, and she was able to raise a lot of money. We're talking $1.5 million, which is very impressive for a leadership race. Now for her weaknesses. Well, first of all, she used to work for the BC Liberal Party, which later became BC United. Now, in her defense, there was a time where the BC Liberal Party was the party that conservatives in BC supported. There was something called the Free Enterprise Coalition, and you had anyone who was a capitalist, so basically the federal liberals that are more like blue liberals, along with the conservatives that were united against the socialists, which are the NDP. So anyone that was a conservative in BC pretty much supported that party. And even Aaron Gunn wanted to run for the leadership of that party. He was, of course, disqualified. But that's basically what you would do in BC when you were conservative. But still, the name BC Liberal doesn't ring nicely these days, especially because of the way that that party collapsed after its disastrous rebranding under Kevin Falcon and going full out woke. I mean, they had just the worst communications ahead of the 2024 election, and they ended up folding. When Caroline Elliott was affiliated with a party, she did some commentary, and she had said some stuff that was definitely more on the pro-liberal side. She did commentary that was seen as supporting safe supply, seen as supporting vaccine mandates, seen as being critical of Christian social conservatism. She had praised Kevin Falcon's position on SOGI, which was not a position that conservatives liked. And she had written an op-ed saying that Canada has a racist past.
The whole point of vaccine mandates, as we all know, is to protect the most vulnerable. So you have teachers in this case in a confined space with what is essentially our largest unvaccinated population, which is our kids. And there's no vaccine mandate coming from the province. As Unina said, the government's always one step behind.
Now, I think that all of that alone wasn't enough to sink a campaign, and is not what sunk the campaign. Look, all of the candidates had baggage. Caroline Elliott had baggage, but so did Yuri Fulmer, so did Peter Milobar, so did Ian Black, and so did Kerry-Lynne Findlay. It was revealed that at one point in her life, and this was a very long time ago in Kerry-Lynne Findlay's defense, that she had supported the federal Liberals. So they all had some sort of baggage here. But for Caroline Elliott, it was the decisions that she then proceeded to make in light of those weaknesses existing, these weaknesses and threats being those past comments, that I think led to her ultimately not performing the way that she and her campaign had hoped she would perform. So after some thinking, some analyzing, as someone who used to be a political staffer and was a successful campaign manager, I have boiled down this to three factors that together accumulated in her, I think, not being successful. The first factor was the decision to hire Doug Ford's campaign manager, Corey Teneycke. Look, this is not a personal attack. I have nothing against Corey personally, but objectively, this man has baggage within the conservative movement. And Mr. Teneycke has baggage for two reasons. First is his ties to Doug Ford. Doug Ford is the premier who imposed some of the strictest lockdowns in North America and bragged about doing so. Doug Ford is the premier that has had some of the highest deficit spending in Ontario history. Doug Ford is the premier that's been accused of allowing wokeness to go rampant in schools, and in some cases even abetting that wokeness. Doug Ford is the premier that praised Justin Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, and Mark Carney, and Doug Ford has been involved in several scandals. Second, Mr. Tanaik has baggage because in the last federal election in 2025, he was accused of having betrayed Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre in the Federal Conservative Party because he would go on panels in the media and criticize the Conservatives while they were actively fighting an election campaign. And that generated a lot of negative headlines for the Conservatives, and it undermined their campaign. So by hiring this individual to be her campaign manager, it did objectively, and I say this because I've spoken to people who've told me that this changed their view on Caroline. It left a sour taste in some people's mouths. Some people, and again, I've spoken to these people, so this is not just my opinion, it's what people told me, began to worry that if she were elected, that she would pivot. Because let's remember, Doug Ford was a populist conservative. His brother was Rob Ford, the most populist of all conservatives, Ford Nation. And then Doug pivoted when he became premier, and people became worried that she would do the same thing. In addition to hiring Doug Ford's campaign manager, she hired his pollster, Nick Lovalis, along with a number of other staffers from Ontario and Quebec. And by the way, some of these staffers are people I know and I like a lot, and I'm not going to disparage them. I'm just saying that this was something she was criticized for. And then she racked up all these establishment endorsements from all these members of the establishment. So when one was looking at that campaign objectively, it looked like this was the campaign of the lobbyists, the consultants, and the establishment. And look, I say this as someone who's worked as a consultant myself. I had a contract for a Fortune 500 company, and I traveled to multiple countries as part of that contract. I'm not here to disparage consultants. I'm just saying objectively, that's what the campaign looked like to a lot of people. And what we have to remember is the BC Conservative Party is the most grassroots Conservative Party in Canada. The BC Conservatives are deeply anti-establishment. In fact, the BC Conservatives came back to prominence because the grassroots in BC were frustrated with how the political establishment was running the BC United Liberal Party that they had previously voted for. So the whole BC Conservative Party in its existence is actually a backlash to the political establishment in the province of British Columbia. Many of their MLAs are extremely grassroots. You have people like Claire Rattay, for example, who's someone that comes to mind, a very, very grassroots person. These are the people that make up the BC Conservative Party. So if you want to become the leader of a party that is anti-establishment and whose resurrection came as an anti-establishment backlash, objectively, having a campaign made up of many consultant lobbyists, insiders, and raking up all these endorsements from the establishment, the political establishment, may not objectively be the best strategy. That's just my opinion. Knowing the conservative grassroots, spending a lot of time with the conservative grassroots, I make a living talking and interacting with the conservative grassroots, and that's just what I've observed. Nothing personal. This is just an observation. Second came the decision to skip the Juno News debate. Yes, I do think this ended up being a major mistake, and here's why. The issue wasn't necessarily skipping the debate itself. It was the domino effect that skipping the debate had. It basically opened a can of worms. So at the start of our analysis, we talked about the weaknesses, the threats, which were the past statements. And we also talked about in factor one, which was some of the people she had brought onto the campaign. And basically, when she decided to skip the Juno News debate, all of that just became front and center and became a way to define Caroline Elliott. It created this narrative that Caroline Elliott was a liberal who was afraid of debating. Now, I'm not saying she is a liberal. I'm not saying that I endorse that narrative. I'm just saying that this was a narrative. I had BC Conservative members telling me this. Yuri Fulmer was on this podcast saying that that's what he thought of Caroline Elliott. He thought she was a liberal. And Caroline Elliott and I even discussed the fact that some people thought she was a liberal. She, of course, disagreed and she thinks she's a conservative. But that was something that happened. And in my opinion, this became a public relations problem for the campaign because she, in my opinion, she was no longer in charge of how people perceived her. There was this other narrative. It was a negative narrative for her campaign that was taking a hold. And the third factor was how Caroline Elliott was responding to this criticism. Early on, amidst all of this, when she was being asked about some of her past statements, she would basically accuse people of reading off NDP talking points. And the reason for that is there was indeed a NDP press release that was attacking Caroline Elliott that had shown some of her past comments that some people will view as liberal comments. But regardless of that, I mean, those comments existed and Caroline Elliott was the one who said them.
Up until this leadership race, you actually supported safe supply, you supported Soldier 108, you supported DRIPA.
No, business operation. Never supported DRIPA in my life. Never. Safe supply, those comments are taken straight from an NDP press release. So we have a candidate in this race who's quoting NDP press releases to talk about things. I would suggest it's not a good source of information.
Now, voters didn't like this response. And again, this is not me attacking Caroline. This is just objective, because when she used that response at the Canada Strong and Free Network debate, she was booed. And eventually she stopped saying this, which again, I think proves my point that she realized it wasn't playing well. So I think you put together the existing weaknesses and threats, and you combine them with these three factors: hiring Doug Ford staffers, plus skipping the Juno News debate, plus responding to concerns by accusing people of reading NDP talking points. And it just did not bode well for her. And as a result, she was unable to win the leadership race. She came close in her defense, but I thought she was going to at least be on the first ballot. I thought Kerry-Lynne would win on second, third, fourth. She didn't win on any ballot, and she ended up not winning the race. And I think this is why that was the case. And I think there's lessons to be learned here. Now, I want to emphasize that none of this is personal, okay? My personal thoughts on Caroline Elliott are actually perfectly reflected by what parental rights advocate Chris Elston, known as Billboard Chris, said on X. Quote, Caroline Elliott didn't win the leadership race tonight, but she is winning in life as a great mom, and I hope she decides to run as a Conservative MLA in the next election. She boldly spoke out against child transitions, and I think she's always handled herself with class. We need more parents with young children in the legislature. They know what matters most. And you know what? I fully agree with that statement. Caroline Elliott came on this podcast. I actually really enjoyed that interview. We had a little conversation after the interview. I really enjoyed that. She, I think, has a bright future ahead of her despite this loss. The purpose of this is to provide political analysis, because that is my job as a journalist, columnist, and commentator. As I like to say, it's not personal, it's politics. And I think constructive criticism is a good thing. I like it. I hope that if Caroline's watching this, she'll take this well. This is just some constructive criticism. And personally, I do think Conservatives benefit from constructive criticism from their own side. So anyways, this sums up our podcast. I want to know what you think. So comment your thoughts down below, like the video, make sure you're subscribed if you haven't already. It literally takes a second and it's free to click. And if you want to take your support a step further, consider getting a paid channel membership that really helps pay the bills here. Until next time, God bless.